There are moments in the wild that no camera fully captures, not because they happen too fast, but because they happen in a language we've nearly forgotten how to read. This is the story of 3 bobcat cubs, a grizzly bear, and one January night in the northern Rockies that shouldn't have ended the way it did, but it did. And the reason why will stay with you long after this is over. The snow had been falling since before dawn. Not the soft, cinematic kind that drifts gently between pine branches, the hard, sideways kind that stings exposed skin and fills animal tracks within minutes. By mid-morning, the forest floor was unreadable, white over white over white. And somewhere in the middle of all that silence, 3 sounds cut through it, small, urgent, and completely alone. They were bobcat cubs, barely 6 weeks old, still with the rounded, oversized paws of animals that hadn't grown into their bodies yet, still with the faint spotted markings that would sharpen as they aged, if they aged. They were huddled at the base of a Douglas fir, pressed against each other in that instinctive way young animals do when warmth is the only currency left. Their cries were not loud. They were the kind of sounds that carry not because of volume, but because of need, high, thin, repeating. A call that had been going out for hours, maybe longer, and had received no answer. Their mother was gone. There were no tracks leading away from them, no scent trail that made sense, no sign of struggle or predation nearby. Whatever had happened to her had happened somewhere else, in some other part of the mountain. What remained was only this: 3 cubs who still expected the world to respond to them the way it always had, because they were too young to know yet that it sometimes doesn't. The temperature was sitting at 11 degrees. By nightfall it would drop further. A bobcat cub at 6 weeks has almost no capacity to regulate its own body heat without its mother's presence, without her fur, her warmth, her milk. Each hour is a slow negotiation with survival. The cubs pressed tighter together. The smallest one trembled in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with physiology. They called out again. The forest absorbed the sound like it absorbed everything else, quietly, without response. And then the trees moved. Not in the way wind moves trees, in the way something large and deliberate moves them, a slow displacement of branches, a heaviness in the sound of footsteps compressing snow. The cubs went still immediately. It is one of the first instincts that develops in young predators, long before they can hunt or climb or defend themselves, the instinct to become invisible when something bigger enters the space. They pressed flat. They stopped calling. The smallest one tucked its face against its sibling's side. The grizzly came through the tree line slowly, a mature male, well over 500 pounds, his coat the deep dark brown of wet bark. He moved the way large bears move in winter, not lazily, but with an economy of effort that comes from having been apex for so long that urgency rarely applies. He wasn't hunting. His body language carried none of the low, focused tension of an animal on pursuit. He was moving through, the way bears move through terrain they've covered 1,000 times, reading the landscape by smell more than sight. He stopped, not gradually, stopped, the way an animal stops when something unexpected reaches it through the air. His massive head came up. His nostrils worked in that slow, deliberate way, pulling the scene apart molecule by molecule. He had caught something that didn't belong, something young, something distressed, something that carried the particular scent signature of animals far too small for this kind of cold. He stood there for a long moment at the edge of the tree line, 8 feet of bear utterly motionless in a way that felt less like hesitation and more like processing. The cubs didn't run. They were too cold to run fast, and perhaps some older instinct, one that predates learned fear, kept them still. Animals that size, that young, have not yet fully mapped which things in the world mean danger and which mean something else. The grizzly was enormous. He was close, but he had not moved toward them with intention, and so they stayed. He took one step forward, then another, then he stopped again, closer now, close enough that his breath was visible in the cold air, slow and rhythmic. He lowered his head slightly, still reading the air, still processing what he was standing in front of. One of the cubs shifted, the middle one, who had been watching him with eyes that had not yet learned to look away from things they should fear. It made a small sound, not a warning, not aggression, something closer to acknowledgement. The bear exhaled, a long low breath through his nostrils, and held his ground. He did not charge, he did not retreat. He simply remained, this enormous animal in the snow, standing in proximity to 3 creatures he could have ended without effort, doing something that had no clear explanation in the standard grammar of wilderness survival. He stayed. And in the brutal arithmetic of a January morning in the northern Rockies, where survival is measured in calories and degrees and minutes, that single inexplicable decision to remain changed the entire equation. The cubs were no longer alone. Minutes passed. The kind that feel longer than they are, measured not in seconds but in breath, in stillness, in the slow accumulation of cold against small bodies. The grizzly hadn't moved far. He'd settled into a posture that wasn't quite resting and wasn't quite alert, somewhere in between, the way large predators hold themselves when they've decided a situation doesn't require action yet. His eyes moved, his nostrils moved, the rest of him stayed. The cubs had stopped trembling quite as violently, not because they were warmer, the temperature hadn't changed, but there is something in the nervous system of young animals, and perhaps in older ones too, that quiets slightly in the presence of something larger than the fear itself. The bear was enormous, he was close, and he had not hurt them. For creatures with no framework yet for understanding the world, that absence of harm carried its own strange weight. The smallest cub moved first. Not toward the bear exactly, more a stumble than a decision, its legs uncertain beneath it, its coordination still weeks away from reliable. It pitched forward slightly in the snow and caught itself, ending up a foot closer to the grizzly than it had been. It looked up. The bear looked down. Neither moved. Then the bear did something quiet and unremarkable, and somehow difficult to look away from. He simply lowered his head back toward the ground, exhaled slowly, and let his gaze drift back to the tree line, as if the cub's closeness required no response, as if it had already been accounted for. That was the moment the coyote appeared. It came from the north side of the clearing, drawn by the same sounds that had drawn the bear, that thin, carrying cry of something young and unprotected. Coyotes are efficient animals. They don't take unnecessary risks, but they are very good at reading vulnerability, and everything about those cubs had been broadcasting it for hours. It moved low and careful through the snow, pausing at the edge of the trees, reading the scene the way predators do, calculating distance, cover, effort, reward. It had not yet seen the bear. The cubs had gone rigid, that deep, wordless alarm that bypasses thought and goes straight to muscle. Their eyes were fixed on the tree line. The smallest one made no sound at all. The grizzly's head came up slowly. He had already known. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a forest just before something irreversible happens. Not the ordinary quiet of snow and cold, something older than that. A silence that the birds feel first, and then the small things, and then everything else. The clearing had gone that kind of quiet. The coyote took one more step into the open. It was close enough now that its breath was visible, short, controlled pulls of air, the breathing of an animal locked onto something. Its eyes were fixed on the cubs. Its body was low, weight shifting forward onto its front legs in that slow, inevitable lean that precedes a run. It had done this before. It knew exactly how this worked. It still hadn't seen the bear. The grizzly rose. Not explosively, there was no panic in it, no scramble. He simply unfolded himself from the snow with the kind of unhurried certainty that belongs only to animals that have never had reason to rush. Full height, full width, an immovable fact standing in the middle of a clearing that had, 1 second ago, looked like an easy equation. The coyote saw him. Everything stopped. And then the grizzly opened his chest and roared, a single sound that didn't echo so much as replace everything else. It moved through the tree trunks and rolled across the snow and erased, for 1 full second, every other sound the forest had been holding. The cubs flattened instinctively. The coyote was already gone, not retreating, not loping, gone, the way animals disappear when survival overrides every other calculation simultaneously. The roar ended. The silence that followed was different from the one before it, looser, breathable, the kind that comes after a thing has been settled. The bear lowered himself back down. No posturing, no scanning the tree line for what might come next. He simply returned to where he had been, the same unhurried weight, the same quiet economy of movement, as if what had just happened was not a decision, not a rescue, not even an event, just the natural consequence of his presence in a space. He had not protected them on purpose. He had simply existed, fully and without apology, in the way that only a few things on this earth still can. And that, just that, had been enough. The cubs lay still in the snow, breathing, together. The smallest one had its chin resting on its sibling's back, its eyes half closed against the cold. They were still here. The bear left the way he had arrived, no ceremony, no backward glance. He simply rose, turned his massive frame toward the northern tree line, and walked, that same unhurried, deliberate movement, each step pressing deep into the snow and then disappearing behind him as the wind moved across the surface. Within a minute, the trees had taken him back. Within 2, there was no sign he had ever been there at all, except for the wide, deep impressions his weight had left in the snow, already softening at the edges, already filling in. The clearing was quiet again, but differently quiet than before. The cubs didn't call out after him. They stayed close together at the base of the fir, the smallest one still half draped across its sibling, all 3 of them carrying that particular exhaustion that comes not just from cold and hunger, but from the accumulated weight of hours spent in uncertainty. They had stopped trying to understand what had happened. They simply remained, breathing, present, waiting in the way that young animals wait, without patience exactly, but without panic either. What they didn't know, couldn't know, was that the forest had been listening. The roar had traveled. In winter air that cold, sound moves differently, cleaner, farther, with less interference from the noise of living things. A wildlife monitoring team working a ridge 2 miles north had picked it up. Not the roar itself on any recording, but the sudden simultaneous silence of the birds that followed it, that unmistakable drop in ambient sound that experienced field researchers learned to read like punctuation, something large, something close to something else, worth checking. They found the cubs just before the last of the light left the sky, 3 of them huddled beneath a Douglas fir, alive in the way that feels both ordinary and astonishing when you've been moving through that kind of cold long enough to understand what it takes from small things. The rescuers worked quietly and quickly, the way people do when they've learned that efficiency is its own form of gentleness. The cubs were wrapped, warmed, documented, thin, cold, but stable, together. None of them fully understood, in that moment, what had kept those cubs alive through the hours between their mother's disappearance and their own arrival. The tracks told a partial story, the rest could only be inferred. But sometimes the wilderness offers you something you didn't earn and can't entirely explain, a moment that operates outside the ordinary logic of predator and prey, of strength and survival, of what is supposed to happen and